Welcome back. It's 9:45. We'll get our next session started, which is the Federal Issues Review Panel. First off, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this panel, Oregon Wire, a Madison Steel Company. So with a new administration in office and changes in control at the congressional level, our next topic could not be more timely or critical. This morning, Joe Heaton and Ryan Yates will provide us with an update and Q&A regarding current federal affairs and public policy issues pertinent to our industry. Again, if you have any questions for the panelists during the presentation, please add them to the Q&A box, the little tab at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We'll get to them, as many of them as we can. I should also add as another housekeeping note, given we're on Zoom and Zoom is far from perfect, if there's any technical issues, add them to the comment tab right next to the Q&A section. Brief introduction for our speakers this morning. Joe Heaton is the Director of Federal Affairs for the Beer Institute. Joe has over 10 years of experience on Capitol Hill as a legislative director and counsel to Congressman Mike Turner and Deputy Chief of Staff to former Congressman Joe Runyon. Joe has a bachelor's degree from Miami University and is Juris Doctor from Penn State University Dickinson School of Law. Ryan Yates is the Managing Director for Public Policy with the American Farm Bureau. Ryan manages the Farm Bureau's Public Policy Department in the preparation and execution of strategies to implement Farm Bureau legislative and regulatory policy priorities. Ryan is a 2003 graduate of California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo, obtaining a degree in agricultural business with a minor in economics. So good morning, gentlemen. With that, I'm going to pass our virtual mic off to you guys and let you guys take it from here.
Great, thanks, Jason. I guess I'll get the ball rolling with my presentation. Thanks to everybody who is joining. I realize that it is kind of a crazy time out there, but none crazier than here in DC, of course. So wanted to obviously talk about, and to those of you who have seen me speak before, glad to be back, and to those who are new to hearing this presentation, I hope you'll find it interesting. I do my best, of course, to be as nonpartisan as possible, when talking about these things. And I think last year I asked everybody to kind of take a guess on whether or not they thought I was personally a Democrat or Republican, and I think I got equal hands in the room when at the end of the presentation, which I think is a good thing. Obviously, there's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. Ryan and I decided to kind of split up our presentations because we both are kind of reacting to the same stuff that you guys are seeing on the news. But what I wanted to talk about quickly was essentially, what actually happened in 2020. Because, when we were, together last year in Portland, I did a whole big presentation on impeachment because it was right at the beginning of the first Trump impeachment, and I did had a little video for everybody on what impeachment actually entailed, and who knew that was going to be the most useful guidance I could have provided, because now we have had not one but two impeachments, as of last week. But in addition to the impeachment stuff, we've had obviously the global pandemic with COVID-19, as well as just the general election and general politics that have kind of been part of American history for over 200 years. So wanted to talk about 2020 really quickly from the brewer perspective. Obviously, we had some pretty fantastic accomplishments despite the pandemic. During the lame duck specifically, we were able to get permanent excise tax reductions enacted into law. So for those of you who remember, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act was a bill that we've had on the docket since 2015. It was passed temporarily into law in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but we were only given a 2-year reduction window. So at the end of 2019, we were extended for 1 more year. So basically, basically by December 31st of 2020, those rates were going to pop back up again to their pre-2017 rates, which for a number of brewers was going to be a doubling of their excise tax rates. If you guys recall from my presentation before, what the bill did is for small brewers, it reduced their federal excise tax burden from $7 per barrel to $3.50 per barrel on their first 60,000 barrels produced. So for those small brewers, if craft beverage wasn't going to be renewed, they were going to see that 350 pop up back to $7 per barrel, which would have been a terrible thing for small brewers to endure, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But as I mentioned, we really hit the hill hard on this. We've been working throughout the course of the year on making some changes to the bill that would kind of satisfy the concerns of some of the folks in the executive branch, as well as some of the folks in the tax writing committees, Ways and Means, and Senate Finance, and the Joint Committee on Taxation, all the alphabet soup types here in DC. And we were able to get everybody to kind of agree on some legislative language that we think is really good, and again, makes those temporary tax rates permanent, which is going to be great for the small brewers and the large brewers who have been looking for increased certainty in terms of their federal excise tax rates. Also in the lame duck, we were able to get some changes made to the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. Depending on how old you are and what generation you're in, you know the dietary guidelines as either the 4 food groups, the 5 food groups, the food pyramid, or My Plate. These are essentially what the dietary guidelines, what they do. They're essentially, guidance for Americans on what they should and should not be eating and drinking. There is actually a chapter on beverage alcohol in the U.S. dietary guidelines, and we were able to work to ensure the continuation of what the federal government defines as moderate consumption. For most of everybody that's listening, I'm sure that you have your own idea on what is moderate consumption, but the federal government for the past 30 years has defined it as up to 2 drinks per day for a man or up to 1 drink per day for a woman. And that's been the guidelines for about 3 decades now. But we had a scientist on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee who felt like he wanted to change that guidance, and we got a bit of a surprise in July. We weren't expecting this at all, that the committee was recommending, instead of that up to 2 drinks per day for a man, they were recommending up to 1 drink per day for a man. So cutting that guidance in half. There really wasn't any preponderance of science that backed up that change. And there was a number of folks in the scientific community who didn't agree with that change, didn't think that the downgrade to 1 drink was backed by science. I want to thank the hop growers and Ann George. I should have thanked you guys for the craft beverage stuff too, because you guys weighed in on that. Same with Ryan's group at the Farm Bureau. But also with the dietary guidelines, the hop growers weighed in on this as well to maintain that 2 drink definition. And so we found out on literally, I think it was December 28th, that the final rulemaking or the final dietary guidelines did not include that change. So for us, we felt that that was a victory of sound science and sound policy. But we think that this next dietary guidelines process, which actually begins next year for the 2025-2030 dietary guidelines, we think that there's going to be significant headwinds from some folks in the public health community that want to, essentially see that that moderate consumption definition reduced, if not to 1 drink, but to no safe level or 0 drinks per day for a man. So we did again get some victories on the dietary guidelines, but we anticipate some headwinds moving forward as we look at the next iteration of those guidelines. Finally, we were able to get some great victories on trade as well. For those of you who have been following, the Trump administration has a very consistent and very strict definition of trade policy. They enacted in both the steel world and the aluminum world what were called the 232 tariffs, which essentially were unilateral tariffs enacted on steel and aluminum coming from literally any country in the world being imported into the US. That was a big deal for the the brewers because we are besides soda, we are one of the largest consumers of aluminum, and there is not enough aluminum made in the United States to be able to meet the demand for all of the beer cans that are used every year. So we actually have to import aluminum, and we've been in that position since World War II. There's literally not been enough aluminum made in the U.S. To be able to sustain all of the aluminum that's consumed here. So we have been obviously trying to get those 232 tariffs repealed. We had some success in getting an exemption from Canada, which is our main trading partner of aluminum. We get about 60% of our aluminum for can making from Canada. So when the administration exempted Canada, that was a big deal for the industry. But we're still paying a tariff-loaded price on all aluminum because of how aluminum pricing is structured. So we also were successful in getting a number of different studies in the House and Senate appropriations bills that would take a look into aluminum pricing and ensure that brewers are paying really a fair and transparent price for the cost of aluminum. So some successes for the brewers on those three particular items. Obviously, we were able to do some other things as well, keeping beer and brewing essential as an essential manufacturing practice over the course of COVID was a huge priority for us and a big victory for us. When the COVID restrictions first began to take place last March, can't believe it's been almost a year, but the first priority was to make sure that beer was made an essential manufacturing practice so that breweries weren't shut down. So we were successful with that as well. We also got some excise tax deferral periods between March and June, which was very helpful as well. So excise taxes for brewers were deferred, not canceled, but deferred for those 3 months as a means of helping out the industry. But obviously there's a lot of work to do for the brewers in 2021, and I'll get to that a little bit as well. But of course, wanted to talk about what exactly is happening in DC, and really what's not happening in DC. I mean, and I'm sure Ryan and I can both speak to the craziness that is the Capitol right now. I feel like every time I give this presentation, it's like it can't get any crazier, and then the next year I prove myself wrong. We obviously have the presidential transition. President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris will be inaugurated into their new offices on Wednesday, so that is still planning on taking place, despite what I believe a loud minority of folks who stormed the Capitol last week would wish. But right now there's approximately 20-ish thousand National Guard troops that are stationed in Washington, D.C. The Capitol is, basically on lockdown. There's fencing with barbed wire even around the Capitol complex. So they are making sure that the inauguration on Wednesday will be a peaceful one. So we are obviously gearing up for that, and I'll get into the Biden administration agenda here momentarily. We also have a new Congress. So Congress was sworn in earlier this month, so they've already begun. Obviously, the House Democrats impeached the president with their new majority last week. So they are already undergoing a fairly, aggressive posture, even in January. But we're going to be spending a lot of time, and I'm sure the Farm Bureau and Ryan's folks will be spending a lot of time going around to new members of Congress and educating them on, the priorities of the beer industry for us. Obviously, making sure that our partners in the hops and barley world are heard that's going to obviously be a big priority for us moving forward. In fact, we've already had some discussions with the USDA folks and the Biden transition team folks at USDA, and Ann and I have worked together on a one-pager that we were able to submit to the transition team on hop priorities in the new administration and things that we need to be looking out for. So we've already got the ball rolling on that, and we'll start again meeting with folks in the new Congress as well. But we're still doing some cleanup work, obviously with impeachment. It's unclear. Well, I think it's actually pretty clear, like that the Senate's not going to take up any sort of impeachment trial between now and Wednesday. Ryan may have better intel than I do on that, but the House impeached the president for a second time last week. So, obviously this is essentially what we ran into last year. The president was impeached by the House, but not convicted by the Senate. Trump hasn't obviously been removed from office, but he is the first president, for better or for worse, who has been impeached now twice. So that is still kind of ongoing. And obviously with the riots that happened last week at the Capitol, I think there is a lot of, energy to holding a lot of folks accountable for what happened. And so even going beyond impeachment and when President-elect Biden is inaugurated on Wednesday, I do think we're going to see some more accountability measures for what happened last week at the Capitol building. So let's talk about President-elect Biden. Obviously, he has outlined a pretty aggressive plan for what he plans to do during his first term. And really, the things that I've kind of listed here are, kind of what I've described to my own members as, the four pillars of things that the Biden administration wants to undertake. Obviously, COVID-19, we did see a COVID-19 package, that was passed and signed by the president at the end of December, but we have heard and we anticipate that there's going to be further relief packages. Obviously, I think the big takeaway from the package that was passed in December was that, those $600 checks that everybody was debating probably isn't going to be enough to sustain a lot of Americans. President Trump even said, they should be $2,000. So I think there's going to be some discussion on that, but also, bailouts of state and local governments who have been stretched thin because of the pandemic. And also from the business perspective, there's going to be a number of things that a lot of the business community are going to continue to advocate for. From the brewer perspective, one thing that is going to be big for us is something that we're pushing as a tax credit for unmerchantable beer. This is a kind of a new issue for us, but something that we're working on with the Brewers Association and the wholesalers. Essentially last March when everything kind of hit the fan with the COVID closures, it couldn't have come at a worse time for beer. March was March Madness, NBA playoffs, the beginning of Major League Baseball season, St. Patrick's Day, NHL playoffs. There were a number of large scale events that were essentially canceled because of COVID restrictions, but all of that kegged beer had been produced already and was somewhere in the stream of commerce between producer, wholesaler, or retailer. And we estimate about $900 million in beer had to be thrown out, essentially, because it couldn't be repackaged. As many of you know, the stream of commerce moves one way from producer to retailer. It doesn't move backwards. So it was very difficult to essentially figure out what to do with all that kegged beer. And as many of you know, you can't just throw $900 million in beer down the drain. You literally have to denature it. You have to take kill the yeast that's in it, and all the live stuff that's in the product. So there was a huge cost associated with all that draft beer that you couldn't do anything with. So we have teamed up with a large group of food and beverage manufacturers. We are not the only ones that have this problem. And we're lobbying essentially Congress for kind of a one-time tax credit to help compensate, whoever was the holder of the beer when the restrictions went into place for the cost or the lost cost associated with that beer. So we'll be really focused on that for the COVID-19 bill that we think is going to be coming down the pike that the president-elect really wants to undertake. After COVID-19, the president President-elect is also talking about a general economic recovery bill. And on this, I think we're going to have to take a look at and really watch out for, corporate tax increases. Some, they're going to call it a middle-class tax relief bill, but I think, it's going to be balanced with potentially an increase in the corporate income tax, which the 2017 bill reduced substantially. So, but again, I think there'll be a general economic relief bill, and we'll be making sure that our federal excise tax rates that we just were made permanent in December aren't in the chopping block for any sort of pay for in an economic recovery package. The other two things that aren't necessarily related specifically to the beer industry or hops specifically, but I just want to touch on them because we will be seeing a lot about them. The racial justice pillar, obviously with George Floyd's murder over the course of the summer, as well as the Black Lives Matters protests and a lot of the other unrest that has occurred because of what the Biden administration is calling racial injustice issues. That we will likely see some form of racial justice bill that will be, kind of gone through the pipeline. The president-elect has a number of different ideas in terms of, police accountability measures, et cetera, that will likely be written into some form of legislation. But we should anticipate that, again, not connected directly to ag or hops, but it will be coming down the pike. So I want to make sure everybody is kind of aware of that. And then also environmental justice. This one does actually touch on obviously ag, because I think we're going to see ag and business under an increased microscope from a Biden administration. So I think there's going to be some form of environmental, legislation that pops up in the first 100 days. We'll see what form it takes. Some people have said, that there's going to be a big infrastructure bill or infrastructure package, and then environmental stuff could be wrapped into that. We're not sure just yet, but we do know that environmental justice was one of the president-elect's major policy pillars that he campaigned on. So that's kind of what we anticipate from a Biden administration. Overall, I will say, the Senate right now is a 50-50 split with the vice president-elect going to be the tie-breaking vote. So margins are very slim. House Democrats have a slimmer majority than they did 2 years ago. So Congress is very evenly split right now. So even with a Democratic president, I think we're gonna see a Democratic president, Senate, and House. I don't think that there's going to be a huge push for major legislation between now and the midterms in 2022, just because I don't think that the majorities are strong enough to be able to push a lot of what Democrats would call progressive policy ideas. So while I did mention all of this stuff in the slides, I would take some of it with a grain of salt. Obviously, campaign promises are not legislative, don't always translate into legislative priorities. And given the slim majorities, I think it's going to be really difficult for a Biden administration to really enact any kind of sweeping changes. But I do think that we're going to see a couple areas for compromise. Infrastructure, as I mentioned, is going to be one of them. So it's going to be a really interesting 2 years. So with that, I think I've been talking now for about 20 minutes. So I'll kick it over to Ryan, and I'll obviously take any questions as soon as we're finished with our presentation. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. Let me try to turn on my slides here. Is that coming through, folks?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Yeah, so again, thank you for having me on today. It's a real privilege. I'm Ryan Yates with the American Farm Bureau Federation, and we are the nation's, if not the world's, largest general ag organization, representing roughly 6 million members in the United States, and representing growers from apples to zucchini, from barley to hops, and everything in between. So again, we appreciate the hard work that you all do And frankly, as a hop enthusiast and a beer enthusiast, again, I have a great deal of admiration for the work that you all do. So thank you for that. I'm going to spend a little time today just kind of dialing in a little bit into some more detail, kind of laying the foundation of the fabric for what we have today, moving into the new Biden administration and the 117th Congress. And then we can open up for some questions and talk about priorities and pontificate about what may happen or what may not. But again, this year, what is an odd year, right? We're dealing with the impact of the pandemic. We're dealing with the tail end of an administration and all of the conflict that we've seen this year, culminating in a very fascinating election in November. Kind of big takeaways of the election itself. This was a big turnout year. Over 158 million Americans voted. It's over 66% turnout, which is the highest national turnout since the election in 1900. So, as we look to kind of the exit polls and the information that we're getting, we're seeing, a great deal of polarization as it pertains to these elections. Again, this year, we saw 50% of voters say that it matters who's in the White House, as opposed to 44 that says it did not. And again, you go back, again, that was 10 years ago. Today, we're seeing 83% of voters say that it matters versus 16%. So again, we've seen a big shift over the last 10 years, in elections, in enthusiasm, and how people engage in the election process. And we'll definitely see future elections where we anticipate, continued polarization, and really don't see that changing in the near future. One of the things, obviously representing farmers and ranchers, we tend to pay a great deal of attention to what I'll call the rural-urban gap. And so again, when we're looking at the percent of the GDP, in counties won by President-elect Joe Biden compared to President Trump, we saw, 477 counties won. And again, these are largely urban, suburban counties across the United States. But again, in terms of the share of the GDP, those urban counties, those Biden counties represent a much larger share of business of the GDP. And so again, as we continue to see that gap widen, obviously that is kind of points to the rift between rural counties and urban counties, and that clash continues to be part of the conflict that we see dividing Americans across the country. Looking at the administration, the transition team has announced a number of key cabinet nominees. We'll see action starting this week in the Senate on the confirmation process. From the grower world, we've got a great deal of interest in a handful of these nominees. Obviously, Mr. Vilsack, former secretary during the Obama administration, is coming back to be secretary again. We anticipate that he would be confirmed swiftly. But again, looking at all priorities that affect American agriculture, Pete Buttigieg, former mayor, nominated for transportation. And again, as Joe mentioned, there'll be a great deal of interest in transportation infrastructure. I would imagine over the coming probably first 100 days. Across the board, trade is a top priority for AFBF and farmers. Access to those foreign markets. Catherine Tai, Hill staffer, former Obama administration. She's been very involved in trade negotiations in the past, and we anticipate that she's going to be a great pick in the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Alejandro Mayorkas, his confirmation, I think, is scheduled for tomorrow. For Homeland Security, obviously, number of issues there that we're paying attention. Michael Regan is another one we're paying pretty close attention to. He is the director of the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina, has not been nominated for EPA. So again, as we're looking at things like crop protection tools, environmental regulation, environmental compliance, EPA changes in EPA policy are particularly interesting to growers. And so again, we're watching the confirmation of Mr. Regan pretty closely. And again, some familiar faces that we're seeing pop up in nominations, including former Secretary of State John Kerry being nominated to be the president's climate envoy. So again, we will likely see a great deal of conversation on the issue of climate. And again, climate discussions, I would imagine, will be interjected kind of throughout all areas of domestic and international policy. So expect a great deal more conversation on the climate front, re-engaging in the Paris negotiations, et cetera. So this is, along the campaign trail, President-elect Biden has spent a lot of time talking about issues of climate and its effect on Americans, American businesses in the future. So, and obviously that's something that we'll pay a great deal of attention to on the broader sustainability conversation. Again, kind of comparing and contrasting the Trump administration, the Biden administration, obviously there's going to be a fair difference of opinions on a variety of topics. The things that we're looking at when it comes to foreign policy, we're hopeful that the Biden administration is going to have a good handle on support for the crop insurance safety net, a lot of reinvestment in ag research. As I mentioned on climate issues, again, we'll probably see much more focus on regulatory actions and enforcement. And again, that goes back to the EPA, and we'll see kind of a big switch there. I mentioned re-engaging on Paris Accords and looking at potentially from a grower perspective, how does USDA engage directly with farmers? Are there markets for carbon, and how does that affect American agriculture? Can we look at, and we're looking forward to the next farm bill, are we going to see opportunities for revenue generation based on climate smart activities from the grower level? So again, that's definitely something worth paying attention to. A few red flags on tax. The Biden folks have talked a great deal about raising taxes on high net worth individuals, and a lot of questions from the grower community as what that'll do to American farmers and ranchers. Trade, obviously, it has been a weird several years on trade. Obviously, going through the trade war with China. Ultimately, we did see some pretty big victories with on the trade front with the China Phase 1 deal, as well as the USMCA and the Mexico-Canada agreement. Again, we're hopeful that the Biden administration will continue to uphold the Phase 1 agreement with China. But at the same time, we want to see continued investment, continued focus on identifying new markets for American agriculture internationally. So that's something that we will likely see some shift in policy with the Biden folks, but again, trade deals tend to move very slowly. So I don't think we'll see any major changes in the trade agenda. And Joe mentioned infrastructure. We're going to see a lot of focus on that. From a rural perspective, rural broadband tends to be something that I see as a strong parallel for bipartisan working in Congress. Same thing with investments in roads, bridges, waterways. So again, I think this is something if we're looking to find opportunities for bipartisanship, that'll be it. Again, some more red flags on the environment. Again, enforcement, regulatory actions. We'll definitely see some major shift in policy there. Labor and immigration, again, there's some other red flags that we'll be paying close attention to in terms of federal minimum wage, overtime pay, OSHA enforcement, things like that. But again, I think generally looking at President-elect Biden rather, remember he's a legislator. The art of the deal is important to him. He's spent many, many years in the United States Congress, and he knows how to cut deals in the Congress. He's very familiar with the process. He's a party centrist. Again, I don't think anybody looks at President-elect Biden as an extremist. So I think he's rode the middle for many, many years, and he truly respects the process and the people and the institution of Congress, and I think that's important. I think generally, President-elect Biden does have an optimistic view of the GOP. He's worked well with them for many, many years, and again, that goes back to knows how to cut deals. I think he's no fool. He recognizes getting anything done in Congress will have to be bipartisan, and so again, I think he's going to be looking for opportunities to kind of reset the working relationship between Republicans and Democrats, especially in the Senate, where I think there's real opportunities for bipartisanship, kind of moving past the the Trump years. And I think, lastly, he's transitional. I think, and he knows that. I think the American public was very clear in the election this year that they wanted a different path for a variety of different reasons. And he's going to be the man in charge to do that. And I think he truly wants to transition the United States into something different than we saw over the last 4 years. But again, I think, as I mentioned, he wants to govern rather than lead a revolution. Now, I would note there are probably many others in his party that don't share those views. And again, on both sides of the aisle, you do have your extremists. But again, I think President-elect Biden will want to ride the middle moving forward. As it pertains to Congress, Joe mentioned we've got very tight margins in the United States Congress for the 117th. Huge freshman class. I think this is the biggest freshman class I've seen in probably close to 20 years. 58, I think that's about right. I could be off by one. There was some remaining races that were late to be called, but roughly 58, 60 new faces in the House, 8 new members in the Senate. The House, as Joe mentioned, will retain Democratic control, but not by much. I mean, this is a handful of votes between, so again, for Speaker Pelosi to negotiate and to find a path forward, partisan issues, partisan bills, are not going to stand a chance, even with the majority that they have in the House. So again, focus will be on bipartisanship. Granted, they'll, when you have the majority, you control the agenda. I guarantee you there'll be a whole lot of oversight. There will be, promises made during the campaign that will be fulfilled, in the oversight capacity of the House. But again, in terms of actually getting bills passed, it's going to be very, very tight. Same can be said even more so in the Senate. With the January 5th runoffs determining Democratic control in the United States Senate. It is a 50-50 split with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who will be sitting as that tiebreaker. And again, in terms of leadership in both chambers, we did see some changes, especially in the agricultural committees. But again, 50-50 split in the Senate. Leadership in the Senate with Leader Schumer now as the majority leader and Mitch McConnell minority leader. In the House, Speaker Pelosi did get reelected, again, not by much. There was a lot of question as to whether she could actually get reelected. And again, with those tight margins, it made it very difficult. But understanding Pelosi, love her or hate her, she's a great politician and she knows how to get things done. And I think the Democratic caucus recognized that and reelected her. Again, the leadership moving from the 116th to the 117th is not going to change. So Steny Hoyer is the majority leader. And Mr. Clyburn from South Carolina will be the majority whip. In the Republican side, Kevin McCarthy, elected leader, with Steve Scalise of Louisiana as the majority whip. So again, looking at big changes here, we're seeing the government is now all in Democratic control. And what does that mean? Kind of before the election, we were looking at different scenarios and how the triple D lineup here could affect American growers. So again, I think day one, you're going to see a number of executive actions taken by President Biden on a variety of different issues. We're paying close attention to labor, immigration issues. We're paying close attention to trade. We're going to be paying close attention to environmental regulation. All of these that have a direct impact on American farmers' ability to produce food and be profitable. So again, we may have a less friendly administration when it comes to those labor and environmental issues, but I think at the same time, there are a number of other opportunities on the infrastructure side, sustainability, and conservation issues. So again, I think, with any administration, we work with whoever the voters send us, and we'll be looking for opportunities to find a path forward on our top priorities. As I mentioned, the ag committees are changing significantly, with the only remaining member of the 4 leaders is Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, who will be the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee. With the retirement of Senator Roberts of Kansas, John Bozeman, who will be the new ranking member on Senate Ag. In the House, we've got 2 new leaders. Congressman David Scott from Georgia was elected by the caucus to serve as chairman of House Ag, and G.T. Thompson of Pennsylvania will be the ranking member. So a lot of new faces, a lot of new staff for my team. In our grassroots, we've got new relationships to build and enhance upon. So there'll be a whole lot of shoe leather or virtual shoe leather work that we'll be doing there. So again, what does that mean? How do we find a path forward with this narrow divide that we find ourselves in Congress? New constituencies and engagement, the Blue Dog Caucus, Problem Solvers Caucus, Main Street Caucus, a number of bipartisan caucuses that have been developed, I think will have a greater deal of influence in finding a path forward on issues of importance to both the House, or both the Republican and Democratic caucuses. And again, with that, I think those caucuses and House and Senate leadership are going to have to find creative ways to work with industry, work with stakeholders, work with the NGO communities, be it labor unions, be it environmental organizations and industries. All of them are going to have to come together and find a way to negotiate some very difficult deals, assuming that we're going to get a few things done. But I think if you're asking me my opinion, I think Joe alluded to this, with the makeup of the House and the Senate, Congress is often referred to as a do-nothing Congress. I've heard that many, many times. When you have tight margins like this, it will limit the amount of work and actual bills that we're going to see passed and ultimately make it to President Biden's desk. At the end of the day, with a few exceptions, you've got to get to 60 votes in the Senate for passage, and so again, that's going to require at least 9 Republicans to get on board anything that's going to move outside of a budget reconciliation, perhaps. But that's going to limit the amount of legislation that we're going to see moved to the president's desk. So what does that mean? We'll see a lot more focus on executive actions, regulatory actions, those executive orders, as Obama used to say, he'll use his phone and his pen. We'll see more of that. I think Trump did a lot of that as well. So there'll be a lot of focus on those executive actions. Again, a lot of, I think, consternation and politicking between Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. I'll kind of touch on a few things that we were focused on this year. COVID-19 obviously, was everywhere, figuratively and literally. We saw congressional action on the CARES Act, which created a number of new programs and resources to businesses, including farmers and ranchers. At the end of the year, we did see an omnibus appropriations as well as a COVID package, a relief package, about $900 billion that was signed by President Trump, that topped up a number of important programs. The Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP. We saw CFAP 1 and 2 implemented by USDA, which certainly was available to especially crop growers and hort growers. And I think and hops are certainly included in the hort and nursery crop section of CFAP. So again, those programs were topped up. We'll see eligibility open back up for CFAP to growers who hadn't participated in the earlier deadline that ended earlier last month. Those will be opened up. So again, if you have questions on that, I'm happy to help, but there's a lot of resources available at farmers.gov if you're looking at additional assistance there. Another important program that we saw for businesses is the Paycheck Protection Program. Again, those resources were critical to businesses that were trying to keep their doors open. And again, the package that was recently passed in the House did include another top up for the Paycheck Protection Program. And in addition, we saw enhanced funding for broadband, financial resources for research and farmer stress, and other several important programs that were included in that. So again, we'll continue to monitor that. As Joe mentioned, the Biden camp is talking about additional recovery and relief packages. And so again, I think there'll be continued discussion as we're not through the impacts of COVID. I don't think we will anytime soon, even with the vaccines that are moving out. It's proven it's tough. It's going to take a while to get those vaccines out and ultimately get the economy in place. And with that, again, I think we'll see continued focus from the incoming administration as well as Congress to identify needs across the economy and ultimately continue focusing on ways to get the economy up and rolling and get past this pandemic. Again, I talked about Paycheck Protection Program. Another important thing for growers is access to personal protective equipment or PPE. And again, so as growers are working with, maybe they've got H2A workers, maybe they've, what other labor force, finding funding for access to the changes that you need to make on the ground at the farm level to ensure that you are protecting your workers. And again, a lot of resources were made available both in the CARES Act as well as the recently passed omnibus. And so again, that's something that we've continued to advocate for to ensure that the farm workforce, food and farm workforce is protected and is receiving the appropriate PPE. In addition, we've reached out to governors, we've reached out to both the Trump and the incoming Biden administration, urging support for vaccine dispersals to ag and food workforce. So again, we want to make sure that make sure that workforce is included in those early vaccine deployment programs. So again, that's something that we'll continue to work with the incoming administration on. A number of other issues kind of moving forward. I mentioned trade, China, phase 1 USMCA. Labor is a big deal. I've been on farms across the country, and the number one thing folks talk about is labor. And so, even before the pandemic, labor is a huge deal. A number of issues with H2A regulations, congressional actions on labor and workforce will continue to be a top priority for AFBF. And again, regulatory reform issues and taxes. Again, we saw the tax package, the jobs and tax cuts passed last year. Again, there's a number of expiring provisions that will take place in the next 2 years. So again, we'll be watching those closely. Things like estate taxes, capital gains, stepped up basis, again, all have an impact on farmers. So again, those are things that we want to make sure continue to be reauthorized. So with that, that's a lot of information. I find it all fascinating, but I'm a bit of a wonk. I think I've been in this town too long. But again, I'm happy to open it up for Q&A, and Joe and I can take a stab at whatever questions you may have. So again, thanks everybody.
All right, thank you, Ryan and Joe. We've got plenty of time here. I think we've got about 45 minutes for the rest of the schedule here. So I think it's a good opportunity to expand on some of the points you guys made. So I invite anybody listening to or watching to post their questions in the Q&A dialogue at the bottom of your screen. I'll start it off with the kind of a general question to expand on, probably more in Ryan's wheelhouse. Well, first of all, let me say, I really think it was encouraging. I think you both gave kind of an optimistic view of how things are looking. And I think that's very important. I agree with that because there is a tendency to be pessimistic in this age right now. So I really appreciate the optimistic view. Given the change in kind of structure in the makeup of the government there in DC, looking at specifically labor, Ryan, what's the major, I would say, shift that you think we'll see in terms of immigration and availability of labor in terms of the philosophy of the previous administration to the incoming administration? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so, I think the Biden administration, or at least the campaign, they've really noted a great deal of interest in ag labor reform in their campaign materials. So again, I think a lot of this interest in ag labor is going to be potentially beneficial to agriculture. When we're looking at efforts to provide a path to legal status, for example, for agricultural workers who've been working in the U.S. for years on farms and wish to continue working in agriculture. So again, we may have some opportunities there, but I think there's some other elements in the platform that might be problematic. For example, support for overtime pay for farm workers, increased OSHA enforcement, the desire to raise the federal minimum wage. Again, all these things we're going to be watching pretty closely. In terms of the Congress, there will be certainly a great deal of enthusiasm for broader immigration reform initiatives such as addressing DACA. Again, I think you'll see Congress want to address that, and that could provide a legislative vehicle for other agricultural labor issues. So again, during the last Congress, we were actively working with Representatives Lofgren and Representative Newhouse from Washington on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And ultimately that bill, it died in Congress, and there was a number of concerns raised by, I know, our organization as to a number of the provisions included in the bill. I think ultimately there are a number of opportunities, significant opportunities for beneficial legislation as it pertains to labor. I think there were a number of provisions in the Workforce Modernization Act that we supported. And again, there was a few things that we had hoped Congress would have worked out, but ultimately that came to a halt due to partisan divisions there. So I would imagine that even with the change in power in the Senate's likely to be a more favorable venue to achieve some substantive reforms that would align with some of the agricultural priorities, at least have been set by our grassroots members. So we're going to continue to work with them, in the 117th, and I'm hopeful that, we can find an opportunity or a path forward. But again, I think one of the sticking points there is truly the issue of margins in the House and the Senate. So, trying to get a labor package done, especially if they're going to be tacking it onto a DACA or Dreamers type bill, will make it difficult to find bipartisan agreement. So those are the things that we're looking at, but I think there's opportunity. I appreciate you mentioning the optimism. Again, at the end of the day, we've got to work with whoever the voters send us. And I think there's obviously, opportunities as well as challenges. And this is one that has a little bit of both.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that we obviously here in the state of Washington are dealing with the risk of, I call it a risk, but the thought of overtime pay on a seasonal workforce, that's, obviously a concern of ours. How much, something like that, how much support does that have at the federal level at this point?
Yeah, it's something we're definitely paying close attention to. I will say, I believe that the governor, I think they've already focused at the state level, and I can't remember exactly kind of where you guys were and the governor was, but I know, talking with our Washington Farm Bureau, I know there's been a lot of kind of heated negotiations back and forth as to what Mr. Inslee is going to do in Washington as it pertains to minimum wage. But again, I think at the federal level, that federal minimum wage is something that we pay attention to, and again, understanding that the agricultural workforce is different. And they need to be kind of looked at differently. The one thing agricultural producers can't do is we can't pass on our costs. And so that's a limitation that we have, and that's why we have to kind of look at our labor and employment issues differently. And I guess same thing when we're looking at H-2A. I know a lot of growers utilize the H-2A program for seasonal employees. I think we're looking to expand that to look at more year-round workers as well. But I think there's some potential changes in H-2A to make that program work better, so we have better access to workers that do want to come in and work those seasonal jobs. But again, I think there's also concerns about the wage rate, the adverse effect wage rate that gets set every year, and how they determine the AWR. Again, those are things that I know our labor lobbyist is working on pretty closely. And I know the administration just finalized a reg on AWR, but it's been being challenged in court. So again, I think there's some uncertainty as to what that wage rate will be and how USDA and DOL are going to set those rates moving forward.
Right. We've got a couple questions from the attendees. The first one I think specifically probably in Joe's wheelhouse, but this next one's kind of related to what you just said. It's related to COVID. Can PPP be used for H-2A workers?
PP.
Yeah.
Repeat that again. I'm sorry.
And PPP be used for H-2A workers? We were told they didn't qualify, but Ryan just touched on that as the question.
I know there were a number of changes made in the recent COVID and omnibus bill. I apologize. I'm going to have to go back, but if you can either follow up with me directly afterwards, and I can fill in the blank on that. But apologize, I don't have that in front of me now. And I'm happy to share my contact information at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. Question from the attendees from Brian. Any updates on the Restaurants Act and probability of its passing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we obviously been following the Restaurants Act pretty closely, and in fact, we were one of the organizations that endorsed it early on because it initially did not cover breweries and tap rooms as a facility for relief. So I would say that it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle for the Restaurants Act specifically, and I'll tell you why. When we talk to a lot of folks on Ways and Means and Appropriations and the other folks that are writing these bills, there's kind of been, I would say, a bit of a conflict between understanding that specific industries were harmed or hurt more than other industries as a result of COVID, but then also not wanting to do anything that's potentially too industry specific in a COVID relief bill. So, Paycheck Protection Program is a good example of that, where, it was basically widespread, it really impacted everybody, that was, small business related, and wasn't specific to food and beverage or hospitality or airlines, et cetera. So, when we talk to folks about the Restaurant Act, some of the pushback we get is essentially, we don't want to do, if we had to do something for restaurants and, and venues, for example, then we're going to have to do something more for the airlines, then we're going to have to do something more for, the music venues, et cetera. So I think there's more of an effort to do things like Paycheck Protection Program that are broader in nature, that aren't industry specific. Now, that's not to say that, something like a Restaurants Act wouldn't be passed in another form that's not called the Restaurants Act, something, that accomplishes what the Restaurants Act would do, some sort of, direct grant program to, small independent restaurants, breweries, tap rooms, et cetera, who are struggling as a result of COVID-19. That could be translated into some other type of program. So I wouldn't count it out. And I know that Congressman Blumenauer from Oregon, this has been, a huge priority for his office. And I think that we'll see that kind of voice be amplified this Congress. But I think it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle for Restaurants Act specifically.
Interesting. Shifting to some environmental concerns. Diane Gooding has a question that, and I think it's a good one. As we go into a more, I guess, concern over whether environmental protection will come through regulation or through incentives or whatever that might look like. Diane's question specifically is there talk about federal carbon credits with a shift in environmental conservation and green energy? What about solar and expanding tax credits or possibly subsidies? Is it possible to see some green energy changes within executive orders, or will it come through Congress?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a great deal of conversation kind of on the broader sustainability and climate front. I think, in terms of I think it will be a little different than we've seen in the past, where we're talking about like cap and trade schemes and carbon taxes and things like that. Happily share that we lobbied heavily against that in the last go around several years ago. And we don't think that's the appropriate path forward when it comes to the issue of carbon and sustainability. That being said, I think there's a lot that we can do in agriculture on the voluntary side. Again, I'm more of a carrot versus a stick type of guy. And I think there's a great deal of opportunity. I think the Biden team will be approaching this very differently. Robert Bonney, who was at USDA in the Obama years, was leading the ag transition team and for the Biden folks. And we had several meetings with Robert. And again, a lot of the things that you're going to see prioritized at USDA is how carbon and how sustainability can be intertwined in the broader agricultural policy discussion. So again, this may be looking at Farm Bill Title II conservation programs. It may be looking at NRCS conservation compliance issues. It may be looking at opportunities for new carbon credits and new markets for carbon, all of which I think agriculture we've got a great story to tell. I think we've got, just in terms of acres enrolled in conservation, We've got more acres enrolled in conservation than the state of California and New York combined. So agriculture knows about conservation. We actively participate in broader conservation conversations. And I think, as we move forward working with USDA and working with the private sector, I think there are going to be additional opportunities for carbon markets that I think we're pretty excited about. One of the things that we've been participating kind of ag-wide is a coalition called Farmers for Sustainable Future. You can Google that. There's a lot of information up there. And I think one of the tough things for growers, there are a lot of really innovative things that we're doing at the farm level that we don't necessarily, we don't always talk about. We don't share those stories. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is be better advocates for the positive things that we're doing on the innovation front. So again, I think we're going to engage head on in this conversation, and hopefully the conversation at the federal level will continue to be market-based and voluntary approaches to carbon. And if that's the direction they want to go, I think there's a great deal of opportunities. Again, if they take a different approach and want to talk about heavy hammer of government and stick versus the carrot, I don't think that's going to go over too well in the farm economy. And especially now, we're dealing with a very fragile farm economy that's trying to recover after COVID-19. Additional regulatory hammers from the federal government is not going to be the appropriate approach to focus on conservation. So that's kind of my take on it. Joe, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the broader, sustainability discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see more of an emphasis put on sustainability, just as a nature of the Biden administration. I think Ryan hit the specifics really well. Obviously, we're taking a look at things from the brewery perspective. Obviously, brewing is energy intensive. From seeds going into the ground to when beer leaves the brewery. So we're obviously concerned about ensuring that any sustainability regulations are certainly even-handed and take into account the downstream effect that it would have on the brewing business. I tend to agree with Ryan that a Secretary Bill Sack kind of USDA is not going to be particularly activist, but I do think that there's going to be some conflict within the cabinet and within some of the top Biden administration officials on just kind of environmental policy and sustainability generally. And again, this is where also the evenly divided Congress and the calculus of Congress kind of, should be considered because of the narrow margins. There are some people for whom anything climate related or sustainability related is going to be a non-starter. And there are going to be some on the other side of the aisle, the AOCs, the Ed Markeys of the world that want to see, the Green New Deal and want to see a far more aggressive posture by the administration. It's going to be really interesting to see, when the rubber meets the road, what is actually going to happen. And again, and Ryan and I both made this point where, with the evenly divided Congress, it'll be interesting to see what exactly passes. Everybody right now in Washington is kind of talking about infrastructure. It's kind of like the big buzzword because it seems to be the one kind of, cross section where D's and R's are kind of agreeing that something needs to be done. But you'll have to see exactly in an infrastructure package, what little things get snuck in terms of environmental policy and climate change issues. So that would be the only other thing I'd add.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, got a question from a familiar name to myself. My brother Jeff wants to know that last year there was some talk of Senator Tillis sponsoring an immigration bill similar to Representative Newhouse's and Lofgren's bill. Any updates on this that you might have?
Yeah, we've worked pretty closely with Senator Tillis on this, and I think between the Lofgren-Newhouse effort and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, our approach was, let the House act on Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Again, we had a few things that just didn't quite align with the policies of farmers and ranchers that ultimately I don't think we were able to get through in the House effort. But again, I think there's folks like Senator Tillis and others. There's a handful of champions that are going to be looking at this slightly differently. And again, as I mentioned in my comments earlier, I imagine more of the reasonable provisions friendly to agriculture will likely come from conversations with Phyllis and others. So again, we're going to be working closely with his team on moving forward on be it the Farm Workforce Modernization Act or some variant thereof. But again, he's been extremely helpful and a strong advocate for agriculture. So I don't imagine that's going to change. And so again, I think it's still a it's a tough path to forge here. We've got those margins in the Senate really make it difficult to get anything through. But that being said, that creates an opportunity to kind of limit some of the more egregious provisions. So again, if Congress really wants to get something done on labor, they're going to have to kind of set some of their differences aside, and I think focusing on that 80-20 rule. So again, you focus on the 80% of the provisions that you can actually agree on, and you set the other 20 aside. If Congress takes that approach, especially labor policy, I think we can get something done. I truly do. There's a great need out there. But again, if we're going to get stuck on that remaining 20%, the stuff on the fringes, it's going to be very, very difficult to get through. But again, Tillis will be instrumental in kind of, finding a path forward there.
I would just mention that, he just won re-election in a tightly contested battle in North Carolina. Where he he was one of the top targets for Senate Democrats. So I do think that you're going to find a Tillis team and an office that is really going to be responsive, I think, and wanting to work even harder. I also think that the other North Carolina senator, Senator Burr, is going to be retiring, and so watching just North Carolina politically is going to be really interesting because there's going to be North Carolina is a bit of a purple state, depending on the year. So I think, and Tillis now kind of ascending to that senior kind of senator role, you're going to see I think him taking some more leadership and a little bit more proactive posturing on certain policies. So
all right, thank you guys. Okay, we do not have any more questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to put you both on the spot with kind of a final closing deal. But so if we were to sit down and do say like an industry-wide SWOT analysis, can each of you kind of indicate in terms of the threats or opportunities, I guess, for that matter, for our industry, what would you pick as your top concern for coming forward into 2021? I'll start with you, Joe. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Top concern. Well, I think I know probably the biggest concern that we're dealing with in the beer world right now is just education of a large number of members of Congress who are unfamiliar with the industry. And I'm sure, Ryan's organization as well as mine, we're kind of undertaking, with such a large freshman class and a brand new transition team, making sure that everybody is kind of up to speed on, what the policy issues are and how they impact Main Street businesses like, the over 8,000 breweries that are, employing Americans across the country. So for me, that's going to be the biggest kind of, I would say, threat is just a lack of information, a lack of knowledge on, our industry. And, for us, it's always a connection of, not just the brewers, but how it connects to an entire supply chain. So everybody from the hop growers, the barley growers, to the brewers, to the truck drivers and the rail cars that are, shipping the beer, bringing in the aluminum, et cetera. But I also would say that that's the biggest opportunity as well, because you have a large group of new members that are kind of thirsty to learn and really want to know more about their constituent businesses. So again, biggest threat for sure, but also probably biggest opportunity for us.
Awesome, thank you.
I think from the ag perspective, some of the biggest things that we're concerned about, I think moving forward, what we're going to do on the tax side of things. Although from a brewer's perspective, I think we saw a big victory with the Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act included in the passed in the end of the year. So again, I think that's a big thing. I think Congress recognizes and appreciates craft beverage industry. And I think they, certainly as we're looking at kind of the public and congressional, outlook and views toward agriculture, toward farmers in general, people hold farmers in pretty high regard, and that spans the political spectrum. So that's a positive thing for us. I think we've seen a number of pretty significant victories for agriculture, billions of dollars in aid this year that we've helped secure, in a bipartisan fashion during the pandemic. So I think on the positive side, I think there's strong recognition that spans the partisan divide, that agriculture is indeed a national security issue, and providing food, feed, and fiber and beverages to American consumers is critical and important. So that's something that I think is a positive thing looking forward. But that being said, there are some threats out there. I think, again, on the tax side of the spectrum, there are some important tax policies that we're going to be paying attention to that could have detrimental effects, not only immediately on growers, but growers that are looking to pass their operations on to the next generation again. And those issues are of profound importance to us. I think on the regulatory side, increased enforcement, increased environmental regulation on growers is something that we need to pay pretty close attention to, and how USDA and EPA are working on those issues. Access to important crop protection tools, and ensuring that the farmers have the ability to utilize the innovation that we've seen take off in the ag sector, and not stifle that innovation through regulatory red tape. So that's something that we're going to pay attention to. And again, we've talked a lot about labor. Labor is critical. Access to a workforce in this country, especially in agriculture, is trying. It's very difficult. And again, farmers from California to Maine, I've visited folks across the country, and I ask them, what keeps you up at night? Labor is number one thing. Access to capital is another. Again, there's some things that really, when we're working in agriculture with the small margins that we have, labor is an important component there. Both I'd say regulation and labor are two issues that we're going to pay very, very close attention to moving forward. And again, I think there's some opportunities for really good policy, but there's also the threat that, again, if you don't do it right, it could have a profound impact on our ability to access labor and be profitable. So ultimately, our job is to ensure American farmers or ranchers can thrive in the American economy, access new markets, and be profitable. At the same time, I think when you have a profitable agricultural industry, we can see increased investment in innovation, increased investment in conservation. None of that will take place if our farmers or ranchers can't be profitable and continue to thrive. So again, I think there's both opportunities and threats moving forward, and we will work with as many folks across the industry and outside the industry to really find those opportunities to tell our story, to help policymakers better understand how the decisions they make in Congress ultimately have an effect on Main Street and farmers and ranchers back home. So again, I'm going to continue to be positive and focus on being optimistic. Yes, we're going to have challenges moving forward, but I truly think that I think the American ag economy is vibrant, and there's a lot to be excited about moving forward.
Awesome.
Jason?
Yes.
I have a question, and I can't seem to add my question as a moderator. I can't add it to the Q&A box. But if I could ask both of the panelists, as we approach the 2022 appropriations process, I'm wondering if you are seeing pressure on existing programs in order to try and offset the extra funding that has gone out in the past several months for COVID relief. Some of the programs we're particularly interested in, of course, through the USDA would be the ARS Hop Research Program, the National Ag Statistics Service, the Market Access Program, and several other research and promotion related programs.
So I wouldn't say specifically on those programs. I do think that there's going to be, at some point, maybe not this year, but at some point there's going to be additional scrutiny kind of placed on federal spending, just because we're throwing out so much money out the door right now. So I think it's healthy to kind of watch your, cover your 6 o'clock. when it comes to, spending. I think that a lot of the offsets, though, are going to probably come from the tax world, and typically do. As Ryan mentioned in his presentation, taxing the ultra rich, et cetera, I think is going to be something that we see targeted a lot in this new administration. I think the corporate income tax is also something that we're going to see a lot of in terms of having to providing potentially an offset for some COVID related spending. But I think, Anne, your instinct is correct that you should be watching out for those things, but I haven't heard anything specifically among the appropriators that they would be, taking a look at like spending cuts specifically for critical programs like the ones that you mentioned.
I think I'll add on to that. I think and I've gone through many of these cycles in Congress, and I think it's, as we get through this period of intense spending at the federal level, we will see some born again budget hawks that will suddenly reappear in Congress and focus on the deficit. And, again, not to make light of it, it's a big deal. We are, no one's talking about offsets at this point. It's all deficit spend. And at some point, I think Congress is going to have an honest conversation about kind of the budget moving forward and how we're going to manage that and control debt and inflation and all of those other economic indicators. So again, I would imagine that, while the budget hawks have largely disappeared, they're going to come back with a vengeance, and it'll make for a very fascinating conversation. And again, I think it'll probably come to light early next year when we have to, extend the budget, the borrowing cap again. So that tends to be those discussions will take place. So a good question, and all of it has a potential to impact, programs that we care about.
And one other thing that I would just kind of mention, because we're starting to see these issues kind of pop up in the states, is state and local governments tend to generally have to balance their budgets. So I think we've seen in Oregon specifically, there was a proposal by the Oregon Department of Health to raise taxes on beer, wine, and liquor as a means of paying for some human services priorities in the state. Ultimately, the governor didn't take up the Department of Health's recommendation, but we're also seeing this pop up in Maryland, Illinois, for example. A couple of states we're starting to see, state level excise tax being considered as a pay for some programs. So I would, I know Ryan and I are more keyed into federal than state level stuff, but I do think it's important for everybody on here to also be taking a look at your local state house issues as well, because to the extent that you are taking advantage of certain tax credit programs within your state, or certain spending or grant programs within your state, those are going to be, I think, really hotly contested over the next couple of years as spending has increased because of COVID.
All right. Well, thank you both. It looks like we have emptied our question box, and we can kind of conclude. I really appreciate the work you guys do on behalf of the industry. Thank you for fighting the good fight for us and looking out for our interests as an industry. I really appreciate the takeaway message for me is that, yes, we do have a lot of challenges in front of us, but there is also the room for some optimism as well, and a lot of curiosity as to what's going to happen over the next few months. So thank you.
Absolutely. And Jason, thank you on behalf of the Beer Institute. I want to thank you and Anne and the folks at Hop Growers of America, USA Hops. We have a terrific partnership. Anne has been just amazing to work with on all of the priorities that the brewers have. We work so closely with y'all and with the folks at the National Barley Growers Association, and we're really glad that we had that partnership. I would say, and I think I've said this before, we are always stronger together. And when we're working on issues in Congress, the more that we can show our unity as an industry, the more successful we're going to be in passing, major policy priorities. And so, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Ryan when I say this too, I hope that we can continue our great work together. And as you guys see issues pop up in your world, feel free to let us know so that we can, engage and leverage our relationships on the Hill and within the administration to help out hop growers. So So we're there for you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. And again, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. And again, to the extent that we can continue to partner and engage on these issues, again, as you mentioned, we're stronger together, and coalition building truly, especially now, is critical in order for us to move forward on things. Happy to continue the partnership, continue the conversation, and to the extent that farm bureaus can be part of that conversation, happy to do that. So again, that grassroots, we can do what we can in Washington, but I can't move mountains here without strong grassroots. And so each one of you are important advocates in this process. And so, building those relationships at the state level, at the district level with those members of Congress is critical for us to be able to leverage those efforts here in Washington. So again, I can't stress enough how important you all are in the grassroots advocacy development process. So again, continue to be your own advocate for your industry, and to the extent that we can leverage those efforts, we're happy to do that. So again, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Okay, I think with that, we're going to transition. Ann, I think, has a couple of announcements to make before we move on. I just want to thank everybody for listening and watching, and I will hand it off to Ann.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to our panelists. That was a fantastic seminar. We really appreciate your expertise and hearing the intricate details of what is going on in the other Washington. Just a few quick notes. Again, I appreciate the participation of everyone who's made this morning's session up until this point possible. I do want to once again thank Oregon Wire, a Madison Steel company, for sponsoring the Federal Issues Panel, and the Hopsteiner Company for sponsoring today's virtual platform. We will be back at 11:30 with our next seminar, and I look forward to seeing you all there. In the meantime, since you have about a 25-minute break, please take advantage of looking at the virtual trade show, as well as the information that you can access through the app for the pre-recorded research presentations by all of our research team for Hop Research Council, as well as the poster session that Hop Research Council has put together. And with that, we will all go find a cup of coffee and see you back here at 11:30 Pacific. Thank you.